Aldia. I sought to shed the yoke of fate, but failed. Now, I only await an answer. Light, dark, or something else entirely. What could possibly await us? And yet we seek it insatiably. Such is our fate.
Alright, welcome back to Honored Madman, everybody. I hope you're doing well, and at long last, we're finally going to be talking about the one and only Aldia, the scholar of the first sin, who some people view as the main antagonist of Dark Souls 2, which isn't true at all. That'd be like Nishandra for sure, Vendrick's crazy wife. Aldia is actually more like a Obi-Wan or Stick from Daredevil type figure, essentially the Al Swearingen to our Sheriff Bullock if you're a Deadwood fan. Obviously, the relationship starts off a bit antagonistic, but ultimately, Aldia becomes a guide of sorts to the protagonist. In terms of humanity as a tribe as depicted in the Dark Souls series, and beyond that, very few beings as a whole can say they've done what Aldia has done. He'd mastered even the most forbidden of forbidden knowledge. He was the first to learn just how fucked humanity had been by Gwyn and the gods. In many ways, Aldia could be viewed as a saint of humanity as a whole, fighting for their freedom from the cycles by any means necessary and at any cost, using measures most couldn't even begin to comprehend. And those who could simply viewed his measures as too extreme or too distasteful. But I'm already getting ahead of myself. To truly understand Aldia, we have to start from the beginning. So at some point during the cycle that Dark Souls 2 takes place in, two very important brothers would be born. Vendrick was the younger brother, while Aldia was the older one, and to say that the overall fate of Dranlek as a whole would be shaped by these two men is a bit of an understatement, because between the two of them and Vendrick's future wife Nishandra, the hands of one of those three are all over just about every single place we visit in Dark Souls 2. But anyway, the younger brother, Vendrick, he was a born conqueror. He would inevitably carve his own kingdom, the future Dranlek, out of this southern land where so many kingdoms had risen and fallen. And contrary to his younger brother, Aldia was more interested in the secrets of the world as a whole. When you're attempting to settle in a place that has as many ruins as Dranlek did of all these various different kingdoms, and you happen to be a scholarly guy, you're gonna take interest in the histories of all these kingdoms that are surrounding you, all these ruins and whatnot. So after his brother Vendrick had finished carving his kingdom out of the ruins of other kingdoms, he naturally extended an invitation to his brother Aldia to serve on his royal court. Something that Aldia had little interest in. He couldn't give half of a shit about the finer nuances of running a kingdom or, how much to tax the peasantry and all this. All that stuff was irrelevant to Aldia, and he preferred to dedicate himself to his studies. In these early days, it's believed that Aldia's first base of operations was none other than the manor in the ruined old town of Majula. It makes sense, as it's got a wealth of books, and a number of oversized ones at that, which seem like they would be the perfect size for a guy like Aldia. You know how FromSoft visual power scaling is. Aldia's human form was probably close to the size of Vendrick's, hence the massive books. And the other interesting thing about this mansion would be the smashed up Lord Vessel down in the basement next to the pet skeleton. Oh yeah, and speaking of pets, there's also 3 small pigs that appear to have been Aldia's old pets, who have since gone insane due to them having been abandoned. Now they're little man-eaters, but I do want to say, if this is Aldia's mansion and this is a smashed up Lord Vessel, I say that studying this artifact, or at least the pieces of it, may have given Aldia some clues as to the true nature of the world. Although me personally, I think the broken Lord Vessel is more of a symbolic kind of thing. Because the Lord Vessel was so important in Dark Souls 1, it housed the souls of the Great Lords. And in Dark Souls 2, it's broken, showing us that things play by different rules in this cycle. Whatever was capable of housing those powerful souls is no longer in existence, or no longer works, or is just broken. Anyway, though, I think a good amount of this stuff serves as hints and evidence that this was quite possibly Aldia's home before he eventually had his keep and mad science lab built. This was long before Aldia had made the decision to sacrifice his metaphorical humanity for his literal humanity, as it were. He was a different guy back then. But one thing that always remained the same about Aldia was his voracious hunger for knowledge. To say he fully embodied what it meant to be a scholar would be a bit of an understatement. I mean, this guy studied everything in creation. Now, his endless quest did start out pretty tame, at least compared to what it would become and eventually evolve into. He familiarized himself with much of the histories of the land he now resided in and its neighboring territories as well. Well, as much of it as he could find, that is, and he learned what he could about the gods of old, namely a nameless Lord of Light, a god of light. It's hard to say how he exactly found out about Gwyn in this unnamed capacity. Now, if I had to guess, I'd say he quite possibly discovered, explored, and studied the ruins of Hyde's Tower of Flame, a flooded, destroyed land that many believe was founded by the Lord of Light's daughter Guinevere and her husband at the time, a flame god named Flann. Granted, all depictions here of the Lord of Light show him with an eagle's head, curiously. And there's any number of other ways Aldia could have found out, about a mysterious Lord of Light of old. But that wasn't really what he was focused on anything. See, Aldia's biggest interest, his greatest pursuit, was the nature of the soul. So, as a seeker of the unknown, when the undead curse started cropping up in Dranlaek, Aldia was understandably fascinated. His scientific curiosity prompted him to figure out what made them tick. So he began dissecting the undead, running tests, both magical and otherwise. He would peer into the souls that he extracted from the various unfortunate test subjects that resided in his halls, and what he saw deeply disturbed him. It was this very development that led to Aldia discovering what he would be known for, what he would come to call the first sin. His people had been shafted by the so-called gods of Anor Londo. Humanity as a whole had been stifled, shackled, as it were, on a spiritual level, made to assume fleeting forms, their achievements stricken from the histories, and on top of all of that, they had been tricked into keeping up the charade for the gods for over a millennia as their willing pawns. Aldia was incensed at this discovery, and it was only after that, the nature of his experiments were said to grow darker by the day. But let's pump the brakes real quick. What exactly is the first sin anyway? And more importantly, why did it make Aldia so mad? Well, long story short, way back in the day, the Lord of Light, Gwyn as he was known back then, with the help of the Chaos Witch, the Grave Lord, the Pygmy Lords, i.e. the first humans, the Giants, and a betrayer dragon named Seath, managed to defeat the everlasting dragons in war, ending the Age of Ancients for good, and the victors were able to emerge from the underground and begin to settle the land's topside. However, this presented the Lord of Light with a small issue following the massive win against the dragons. The furtive pygmy whose clan that Gwyn had come to rely on for support during the war with the Great Dragons was in possession of a unique soul, a dark soul, if you will, and this soul in particular was unfathomably different from the mighty light soul that Gwyn possessed, as well as the other lord souls of his colleagues. The Dark Soul, unlike the other great souls, sort of endlessly fragmented itself amongst the Pygmy Lords and their descendants, and despite this, it did not lose any of its power as it was divided into the first humans. Unlike Gwyn's own soul that did lose power when he broke off a piece for Seath as a reward for betraying the dragons that had bullied him so much for being bald. Now, this fragmentation was likely because the Dark Soul was known to produce life through the Abyss, which was something that absolutely scared the shit out of Gwyn and his kinsmen, as he knew one day they would be outnumbered by the humans and this Dark Soul, and that was a reality that just did not compute with Gwyn. He did not even want to consider it. So naturally, Gwyn would first attempt to resolve this potential issue without bloodshed or war, as war with the humans was something he preferred to avoid, as even if he attacked unprovoked with the full might of his power and the element of surprise, there was still this overwhelming certainty deep down in his heart that he would eventually lose that conflict. Especially based on numbers, as the humans multiplied extremely fast compared to Gwyn and his godkin, and it's not like these humans were slouches either. They had fought alongside Gwyn and his Silver Knights and proudly fashioned weapons from the dragon remains of their kills. Gwyn wasn't a fool. He knew that an all-out war with them would be hopeless, so he instead chose a more treacherous method in how he was going to deal with the humans and the pygmies. First, he got the Pygmy Lords, or is it the Pygmy King, either one, to swear fealty to him as a vassal in exchange for a Chloranthy ring, it seems like. He then offered the Pygmy King's clan a grand city that could rival Gwyn's own lofty home in Anor Londo, although conveniently this new Pygmy city was situated at the end of the world, pretty much a place that could only be reached at the end of time. Essentially out of sight and out of mind, and also out of time. By doing this, Gwyn had somehow managed to convince the Pygmy King that his clan, the first humans, while valued and respected vassals in this new regime, were in fact inferior to Gwyn's clan, who were now referred to as the gods. The Pygmy lords didn't really mind, as they largely governed themselves, and as a so-called sign of good faith, Gwyn even gave his youngest daughter Filianor to the Pygmies to further guise his true intent of keeping the humans under his thumb, as he figured being charged with the care of a god's daughter would make them feel important. He figured he was giving them this divine duty and made them feel like his loyal vassals that he was willing to entrust his daughter to. And although Gwyn secretly promised Filianor that he would one day return for her, I don't think he ever had any intentions of keeping that promise. I don't think he cared too much. He probably just figured, I'll make another kid. So far, Gwyn had achieved his goal of keeping the humans loyal and as far out of the way as possible, in a place where almost no one could even find them. And those unfortunate enough to actually find themselves on the steps of the Ringed City probably wish they never went looking for it in the first place. But all that success, well, that really wasn't enough for Gwyn. He still didn't feel safe knowing something like the humans were still out there, existing. So he took to rewriting history, because as the victor, he can do that. And while rewriting this wiki, he left out all mentions of the contributions of the humans in the war against the dragons. The Ring Knights, as I already mentioned, had been extremely capable dragon slayers who didn't need cheap lightning miracles to bring down their prey. That small fact alone probably scared the living shit out of Gwyn, so in order to truly not feel scared, Gwyn did what many would call the unthinkable. And by that I mean he used the power of the First Flame to brand the Dark Soul, and by extension all of humanity, with a ring of fire. My guess, he was a big Johnny Cash fan. And that would eventually be known as the Dark Sign. We're talking about a brand on their very souls, but it also appears on their flesh as well, as a sort of swirly void. So now, thanks to Gwyn, all humans would be marked before they were even born, shackled, and worse than that, they were ignorant of the very shackles that were on their feet and arms. The Dark Sign suppressed the power of the furtive pygmy, and by extension the Dark Soul's descendants, as in all of humanity, completing Gwyn's great deception of making the pygmies believe they were less than the gods. But Gwyn's best laid plans had not been a complete success. Humanity and humans at their core still retained a connection to the abyss, and many would either inadvertently or advertently openly flaunt the Dark Sign's inability to nerf them completely. The brand was certainly effective in other aspects, though. It essentially resulted in mankind assuming what Aldia would call a fleeting form, as humans tend to do, when by rights they should essentially be on the same level as the so-called gods. Now, one thing Gwyn didn't account for was the flame's eventual fading. This unexpectedly caused that brand he'd placed on humanity to go a bit wonky, so to speak, and now humans could no longer die. At least for good, they would be reborn upon death and slowly begin the extremely long process of going hollow. Losing pieces of themselves little by little, with the only treatment being the use of the souls of the fallen as a sort of patchwork salve on their sanity. And on top of all of that, and I do know that it's a lot, Gwyn would also use his dying wishes to instruct his colleagues to manipulate the humans into continuing the linking of the fire to prolong Gwyn's age of fire, using Gwyn as an example after he became the first sacrifice to the flame. With this, he presumably hoped to keep the age of fire going on indefinitely. The Dark Sign in retrospect made this deception easier as well, as when the fire begins to fade, a curse would begin afflicting the humans, and they would begin rising as undead, and these undead were the perfect candidates to be tricked into keeping the Age of Fire going. The piece of the Dark Soul in them would presumably be sufficient kindling for the first flame, although this isn't always the case. The Dark Sign essentially tied humanity to the first flame in the most unpleasant of ways possible. The stronger and brighter the first flame burned, the more suppressed the human's true potential would be. It also eliminated the undead curse. Now, as the flame fades, however, humans, and by extension the darkness, grows in power. Although here's the thing, that power had been warped by Gwyn's meddling, so it manifests itself as the curse of the undead. In many ways, the curse is the ultimate proof of Gwyn's deception against the pygmies. Again, sorry for this long-winded detour on the first sin in Gwyn and this whole history lesson. So in short, Gwyn, the illustrious Lord of Light, inadvertently created a plague that would ravage the world for a millennia because he was afraid of the hypothetical darkness, the potential of an entire race of his colleagues. But that was okay because he managed to use even this fuck-up to his advantage in the end. by turning the humans into his eternal servants right before he went and committed fire seppuku. I guess the ultimate joke is on him because he hauled out in the end as well. But anyways, this was likely what Aldia learned after peering into the souls of the countless undead that he experimented on. Aldia had gazed into the void and learned that humanity was truly fucked. But being the type of guy he was, he didn't accept that. He resolved to change the course of fate, and suffice to say, after learning of this first sin, he became driven to end the curse and cast off this forced yoke of fate. In addition to this, Aldia's resources for his work only grew after his brother became king and granted Aldia the seat of duke. And thanks to Vendrick's numerous successful conquests, his elder brother had no shortage of subjects for his research and experimentation, which only grew more unhinged with each new discovery. Aldia theorized that an age of fire fading would give rise to the dark, and that an age of utter darkness would follow. It was the natural course of events, so it made sense, but in theory, dark would eventually stagnate as well, and the world would remain unbalanced. What Aldia was truly curious about is what would follow an age of dark that had just followed an age of fire. But what about an age that was truly free of the endless cycles? That was the real unknown, and it was something that Aldia would ponder for the rest of his days. Neither an age of dark or an age of light would have true balance, so Aldia determined that the only way to free humanity from its shackles lied beyond both light and dark. Something new and unknown, but in order to remove his people from this cycle, he would first need to study the only things that existed before the flame. Well, besides the fog and the archtrees, the everlasting dragons. The ancient reptilian creatures that once ruled the land before the time of gods and men. Aldia was fascinated by dragons. They existed beyond the cycle. There was something timeless about them, everlasting, if you will, and he came to believe that they, along with the undead, were the keys to achieving his goals. There was only a problem, though. Unlike the undead, who were numerous enough for him to have studied hundreds of times over, hundreds and thousands of different specimens, the dragons were long believed to be extinct. But Aldia wasn't about to let that stop him. If there were no dragons to study, he would create his own to study. He began searching for any dragon remains or bones he could find and set about to return the dragons to the world. And look, to say this work produced horrific failures would be an understatement, but the mad scientist continued on undaunted, performing various tests on experiments on any dragon remains he could get his hands on. It wasn't until Vendrick and his wife's schemes allowed Aldia access to a whole new slew of specimens, the giants, the creatures his brother had warred with. This cycle's giants weren't like the giants of Anor Londo in Dark Souls 1. They were hulking brutes of stone and earth that had a void for their face. This cycle's giants were endowed with a very unique physiology. They had skin of stone, not unlike the archdragons of old, and upon close examination, their souls appeared to be perfectly in balance with light and dark, something that was truly an anomaly to Aldia and his assistants. See, because when examined, souls are generally light, but some are dark if they've been influenced by the abyss. Take Raim, the Foom Knight of Broom Tower. His soul is completely black, due to his rather obvious abyssal corruption. But compare that with Vendrick's soul, which is depicted as a fiery orange soul of light. But the souls of these rock giants, on the other hand, were seemingly existing in some sort of harmony between light and dark, and the resulting research that followed this discovery would cost countless giants their lives. But Aldia, he would have his breakthrough, at long last. And presumably after numerous failures, an ancient dragon was finally reborn into the world, and what a mighty specimen it was, eventually taking roost in those weird rock spires out behind Aldia's place, in a domain that would soon become known as the Dragon Eyrie. And the only way to reach this place was if you had wings, so naturally Aldia constructed a massive elevator that went from the ancient dragon's former cage to the top of the rock spires where they had settled in. Now, it's not confirmed anywhere, but I believe the only reason Aldia was able to resurrect an ancient dragon through the use of giant souls was because the giants were quite possibly the reincarnations of the everlasting dragons. Or maybe they were some sort of spiritual evolution. They possessed the same souls that the dragons may have had. They certainly filled a similar narrative role to Vendrick as the dragons did to Gwyn. I think this mirroring was intentional and meant to reinforce the idea of cycles and how this has all happened before many times, which is actually one of the themes Dark Souls 3 picked up from Dark Souls 2 and sort of ran with. But as I say, way too much, that's probably a story for another day. But anyway, though, this scientific discovery would make possible countless new experiments, and to handle this increased workload, Aldia would need an extensive and fiercely loyal staff. And in this newly resurrected dragon, Aldia saw a way to solve that problem. Religion. An old dragon cult was reintroduced to Aldia's staff as well as the world at large as a way to recruit more to their number, to serve the dragon. The cult promised them ascension through dedication. And as both our real-life history and countless fantasy and fictional ones have demonstrated, religiously motivated followers were often the most loyal and dedicated to their causes. Basically the ultimate way of ensuring loyalty. And it's also a great way to indoctrinate people. So the rules and hierarchy of the cult were strict but simple. The perspectives became acolytes and served Aldia as research assistants and occult scientists. They carry out tasks such as dissecting subjects and performing rituals and cleaning up the messes that are created both during and thereafter the experimentation. When an acolyte was deemed worthy, they were allowed to serve the ancient dragon and its ever-growing shrine directly as Drake Keepers. Now these hulking warriors' tasks appear to have been to simply just guard the dragon shrine and tend to the hellkite drakes that sort of infested the dragonary. Although this proud station did little to ease the minds of these guys, it was said that something dark ate away at them. Perhaps it was the years of serving a mad scientist. I mean, these guys probably did have to do some pretty horrific shit to get this illustrious new job. But I suppose nothing in this world is gotten without sacrifice. Anyway, it seems as though if a Drake Keeper or an Acolyte's dedication was strong enough and their hearts were said to be without regret, then they would be one of the chosen few that were able to join the ranks of the Dragon Knights, warriors who were now quite literally part dragon. They sort of look how the Dragon Keepers were described in the Game of Thrones history book Fire and Blood, as opposed to how they were depicted in the House of the Dragon show. Again, story for another day. Anyway, though, most of these acolytes simply remained research assistants indefinitely, but they didn't mind though. They were bringing back the dragons into the world, and these dudes just wanted to be a part of history, even if it cost them their humanity. Aside from the dragon acolytes, though, Aldia also employed a handful of sadistic yet very loyal warlocks, and these guys generally served as supervisors to the dragon acolytes in Aldia's keep in the secret wing. And these horned fellows' jobs likely included ensuring quality control, basically making sure everybody washed their hands before the brutal dissections, that sort of thing. The warlocks themselves were likely acolytes and at some point or another were Aldia's most high-ranking vassals. Now, an alternative route of promotion for the acolytes that was more religion-oriented but was seemingly adjacent to the warlocks was the slightly more rare dragon priestess. Only one can be found in the game, so I think this individual is probably considered a high priestess, but they can be found tending the dragon eggs of the Aerie, and this dragon pope is seemingly an exalted figure in Aldia's restored dragon cult, and they of course wield lightning miracles. And as I mentioned earlier, the Aldia warlocks were nearly just as rare. I believe there's only really 2 or 3 of them. I mean, there's also an NPC invader named Merciless Runta who appears to also be an Aldia warlock, but one of these warlocks presides over the experiments being conducted by the acolytes in the hidden research hall of Aldia's keep, and the other was seemingly sent to Brightstone Cove, Seldora, on a salvage mission, presumably in search of that dragon carcass down below, deep beneath the town. Or alternatively, that one was sent down there to round up some of that unique breed of hollow that the region was producing. They seem more afflicted by the abyss or darkness there. Now, with this extremely competent new staff, Aldia and his new licorice assortment of tasty mates would get up to no small amount of mad science. That is kinda their thing, but ultimately the obsession with dragons played second fiddle to Aldia's obsession with the nature of the soul. So he began drawing out the true nature of beings through their souls, and the results were sometimes hilarious. For example, a particularly inspired one of Aldia's creations had to be the Lion Clan warriors. Once this proud and fearsome clan of Frozen Lion Knights, figures straight out of legend, now reduced to a primitive race of dreadlocked beast people, the Lion Warriors, who you can find scattered and often petrified throughout the shaded woods, a area that's filled with jars of laughing abyss, so be careful. Oh yeah, and ghosts. But one of the main things his staff seemed to focus on was creating human-dragon hybrids. Now, naturally, this sort of chimera business produced countless horrific abominations, whole races of them in some instances, to be exact. Take a look at this Fallout Centaur-style monstrosity that was created in the halls of Aldia's Mad Lab. It looks like one of the props straight out of something like John Carpenter's The Thing. And I believe one of the given names that this enemy monstrosity fucking thing has is an enhanced human. Yeah, let that marinate for a bit. As I said a little bit ago, though, whole races of abominations were created because of this unchecked mad science. No one knows exactly what the forbidden rites of Aldia and the land of Aldia really were, but they don't appear to have been pleasant. And they certainly had long-lasting effects on the land of Dranlek as a whole once a few of them got loose from Aldia's keep. These monstrous beasts include, but aren't limited to, the goblins of the shaded woods, made famous by the gatehouse ambush at the entrance to these very same shaded woods. You know, when you pull the lever and you just get swarmed. These festering savages appear to be cannibalistic and poisonous. They plague almost every section of the shaded woods using rudimentary weapons and setting up these ambushes, and of course they can often be found feasting on the corpses of their own. Then there's also the more dog-like kobolds, which is another word for goblin. These impish hounds are often found riddled with curse, but have some tremendous drops. Like, they have really cool drops for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe that's just a fluke on my part, but I've gotten like pretty rare spells dropped from these dog goblins, so keep that in mind, although I can't remember if that was in a New Game Plus or not. Aldia's lab may have also produced the ogres as well, but I can't quite confirm this one in the same ways that I can probably confirm the case for the goblins and the kobolds. Aldia either created the ogres or he was extremely fascinated by them or their use as guard dogs, because he's got, I think, 3 or 4 of them in his keep, so I think it is entirely possible that he had them created to serve as powerful guardians to protect his research. Anyway, though, Aldia actually uses these goblin dogs, or at least a pack of them, as guard dogs in the courtyard of his keep. Their connection with the curse probably fascinated him, as just about anything's connection with the curse tended to fascinate Aldia. So yeah, the forbidden rites of Aldia produced all manner of unspeakable fucking creatures. And this was all, of course, in pursuit of creating a solution for the cosmically existential crisis humanity was currently going through. But the closest he came to success was still deemed somewhat a failure, and that creation was Shanalot, or the Emerald Herald as she's known to many of us, perhaps more famously by her catchphrase.
Bearer of seek lest this...
Aldia and his assistants, people like Novlon, would refer to her as the Muse. And she was largely his greatest scientific achievement after bringing dragons back into the world. His work had produced a firekeeper that was essentially free from the fire. Born of dragons, contrived by men, wholly removed from the cycle, but capable of turning lost souls into strength. Strength for a champion that could one day accomplish what Aldia himself could not. But we're going to talk more about Aldia and his legacy and his various successors, as well as his impact on the world of Dark Souls 3 in a little bit. So we're going to put a pin in this right here while we finish talking about Aldia's various contributions to the kingdom of Dranlek, led by his brother Vendrick. Now, in addition to his own mutated creations, there was also a number of creatures that Aldia didn't necessarily create, but was nevertheless fascinated by. For example, the basilisks, an iconic creature of the From Software series. Now, this particular fascination was a bit unsurprising given the basilisk's innate ability to breathe cursed breath, and their ability to petrify other beings, which made them much easier for transportation. The basilisks themselves were carted to and from Aldia's keep, and the Lord even kept a particularly large one in his main hall, all caged up and guarding his secret wing, seemingly as some sort of trophy of some kind. Whether or not its abnormal size is natural or the result of Aldia's soul tampering is anyone's guess. Interestingly enough, though, the giant's petrifying breath seems to have turned Aldia's lobby into a scene from Hyrule Castle in Wind Waker, as just like in that cutscene, all of the guards are frozen in time. Now, among the more exotic creatures Aldia had imported to Dren Lake was the giant acid ant queen from the desert land of Jugo, where Benhart and the sexy pyromancers come from. These ants were famed for their corrosive secretions. The acid they produced would eventually be used to create an elaborate moat in Dren Lake Castle capable of destroying any and all inorganic matter, meaning it only hurts the equipment of those who dare pass through it. He also developed these cool dragon-themed acid dispensers, but that wasn't Aldia's only contribution to the kingdom of his brother, not by a long shot. His tireless dragon research had provided Vendrick's finest knights with Hellkite Drake mounts that gave them their namesake, the Dragon Riders. Aldia's studies created countless impressive inventions like the Mirror Shield, for example, that would be made famous by another fearsome warrior in service to his brother the king, the Looking Glass Knight, who would eventually cover Vendrick's own escape from his wife many years later. The unique nature of the Mirror Shield allowed the knight to summon a squire, quote-unquote, from another world. Aldia was suitably impressed with this creation, as he would go on to keep several of the prototypes of the shield as these deceptive decorations in his castle that would double as effective countermeasures to ward off the unsuspecting trespasser. Now, presumably in his effort to develop this technology, Aldia managed to sever a number of individuals from their home worlds. Now, these unlikely folks would become the Forlorn, undead cursed to forever wander between worlds as red spirits, exactly like the famous Nick Cage movie Between Worlds. Now, these individuals wear intricately crafted and designed black skeleton-themed armor. It almost seems as though their unique weapons and armor were made specifically for them, so in a sense they could be seen as the unofficial knights of Aldia, or at the very least his unseen hands that could carry out assassinations or abductions on his behalf. Now, it's not currently known where this immensely cool gear of theirs came from. I mean, did they manifest it from Hammerspace? Just from being profoundly forlorn, or did Aldia have it crafted for them as a symbol of office to honor their service to him in some way? Well, again, your guess is as good as mine, dear listener. What is known about the Forlorn is that Aldia managed to replicate the magic used to bound the insolent spirits to the undead crypt, something he likely had Navlon's help in doing. But his main purpose for this magical achievement was to use said crypt magic to bind several of these forlorn spirits to an intricate torch system throughout his keep so that they could serve as glorified guard dogs. These forlorn warrior women often made short work of anyone dumb enough to light the torches, and that's one thing I did forget to mention, is that all of the forlorn are noticeably women. Do with that what you will. In short, though, the Forlorn seemed to be an unfortunate bunch of failed projects that were repurposed as wandering killers and enslaved spirits. I like to believe they eventually found peace as crow people in a particularly frozen painting that may or may not be rotting away by the events of Dark Souls 3. Gameplay-wise, they're a bit like the Pursuer, ambushing the player from time to time throughout the game, sometimes at the worst possible time and place. And much like the Pursuer, it's currently unclear if these wandering forlorn are even still acting on Aldia's behalf. So yeah, it's not confirmed, but as I mentioned earlier, I do believe they helped carry out the abductions of both foreign and domestic nobles for Aldia and the boys to experiment on. Lord Aldia's highest-ranked lieutenants, the antler-headed warlocks, certainly did, just as they regularly participated in the harrowing rituals that were conducted on the abductees, which almost always resulted in some of the most horrific abominations that you could find in Dren Lake. However, through this relentless study and pursuit, they achieved several breakthroughs in the form of spells and other magical artifacts, and Aldia and his henchmen were more than happy to reap these rewards after their tireless struggles. Now, the funny thing is that the abductions weren't even necessary in the early days of Aldia's organization. You know, before the notorious rumors of the unspeakable acts that were carried out there began to spread, Aldia would send out invites, much like his brother Vendrick, who was said to have invited all manner of guests, foreign and domestic, to his keep, regardless if they were charlatans or the real deal, all in an effort to help find an end to this curse. And ultimately, while Aldia's goals and reasoning for inviting the guests to his keep were very similar to his brother's, he certainly had a different way of going about it. He definitely didn't invite them to his keep to hire them like Vendrick did. So countless nobles and adventurers from both far and wide would come to Aldia's keep to visit and admire the various oddities and curios that the Lord had amassed in his very museum-esque manner. Now, naturally, these unfortunate nobles were turned into monstrous abominations, chimera-like beings, and a number of powerful rings and artifacts and spells were created through the research of their creation. So yeah, this all did seem a bit excessive, but it produced results, and by that I mean it created a lot of cool shit. Not to mention the numerous benefits it brought to his brother's kingdom, such as the creation of those powerful warriors like the Looking Glass Knight I already mentioned, and the Draconic Mounts for his elite personal knights, the Dragon Riders. There were numerous things born in these pitiable halls that it can be argued were worth the price of admission. A lot of this research and achievement would stand the test of time and wouldn't have existed if not for this, shall we say, boundless scientific exploration of humanity and the undead as a whole, as well as, of course, the nature of the soul. Aldia learned a whole hell of a lot at a considerably great cost, and this was all ultimately in the name of unraveling the secrets of life itself. I mean, even on a smaller scale, without Aldia's brutally pragmatic experimentation, we wouldn't have stuff like the rotating sunset staff or the Spitfire spear, a weapon said to be empowered by a great flame. I wonder how that was done. I wonder if that flame god Flarin is residing in that. His work also created 2 rings that would become known as the secret treasures of the land of Aldia, the northern and southern ritual bands, and it's implied that their creation exacted quite the substantial toll. But it's said that the madmen of Aldia would gladly pay said toll with the lives of captured nobility. Now, there were also a handful of dreadfully powerful spells that were developed in Aldia alongside these other inventions, including but not limited to the Forbidden Sun, a favorite of mine just for its name alone. It's essentially an extremely destructive take on the Fire Orb pyromancy, probably made via research into chaos. Unleash Magic was another one, more or less self-explanatory. Its description specifically mentions the shadowy creatures that were all born, eerily malformed in the secret halls of Aldia's keep. And the last of these spells would become both Aldia's legacy and his final heirloom in the far future, the Soul Geyser. It's said to be as blasphemous as it is powerful, and it's essentially like the Proto-Azur's Comet from Elden Ring, a Dragon Ball-style energy blast that continuously strikes its target until it's erased from existence, or crossed off the census, to quote the great Casual Geographic YouTube channel. Now, this spell was truly worthy of Aldia's name, and although that part would curiously be forgotten over the ages, it's worth noting that his legacy as a scholar would live on. Now, it's also worth mentioning that Aldia and his assistants also had an inhabiting spirit, or alternatively an entity of sentient magic known as Navlon, assisting them in the creation of all these horrific creatures and badass artifacts. Now, this spirit was currently piloting the body of an old sorcerer whose identity is a bit of a mystery, but it's generally believed to have been a dude known as Olenford, or at least the most substantial theory is based around this. Olenford was the founder of magic in the land of Melfia, who descended into the undead catacombs in search of new spells. What he found, however, was likely more than he bargained for. Now, while the sorcerer Olenford is probably the host and likely creator of Navlon, it doesn't necessarily mean he didn't also receive a bit of help in the form of a deranged spirit of a necromancer. And yeah, that's a pretty vague way of putting it, so I'll explain. There's a description that talks of a sorcerer, presumably Navlon, being executed alongside his entire village for the crime of necromancy. After their subsequent execution, it's possible that some of these heretic villagers could have been laid to rest in the catacombs, and when Olenford went down there and started cooking up new spells, the inhabiting spirit that would one day be known as Navlon sort of interfered and essentially became sentient magic. He sort of maybe blended with one of Olenford's spells and became this undying sorcerer lich ghost thing that then took possession of Olenford's body. Obviously, this is just speculation, so, just take it with a grain of salt, but Navlon is certainly an interesting character. He's definitely a character that would benefit from further exploration, in a future video, perhaps. I like the idea that he was just some ambitious sorcerer who set out to discover and create new magics and inadvertently created some sort of twisted sentient magic that then took over his body and burned his home village. There are, of course, many other theories, which we will get into one day. This being, whatever it really is, was a prolific hexer and could cast without a catalyst. Perhaps because he is sentient magic. He famously created the dark spells Scraps of Life and Darkstorm and eventually wound up as Aldia's court mage. A more fitting place probably didn't exist for him. He went about his service in Aldia's keep, inventing spells and conducting brutal, gruesome acts in the name of research, until he himself wound up in a cell in the very same keep he'd been in service to. The only important thing here to note about Navlon is that he served Aldia and was responsible for the burning of the village of his birth. Navlon's host village, that is. Anyway, though, Navlon, he served Aldia as his court wizard and assistant in the matters regarding the dark arts, and together Aldia, the boys, and Navlon carried out countless crimes against the population of Dranlake in secret, as well as its neighboring kingdoms and other foreign lands. Now, eventually, after who knows how long, Vendrick had finally had enough. It wasn't enough that the ninjas he'd hired to clean up his undead problem had hollowed out themselves. Hollows, that was a word that haunted Vendrick's dreams. These were the same hollows that his brother Aldia now viewed with a twisted form of reverence, and Vendrick decided to metaphorically cut ties with his brother by imprisoning him in his keep, locking out several of Aldia's agents, leaving them to their own devices. The abductions, the rumors of twisted experiments, and of course the shaded woods being turned into a playground for said alleged experiments, it all proved to be too much for Vendrick, and this was essentially the part of the story where, if this were a Scorsese film, they would start playing the Rolling Stones, specifically like Give Me Shelter or something. Anyway, though, any and all of Aldia's creatures that managed to escape the shaded woods, research subjects who were locked out of the keep or otherwise, were disposed of and deposited into an inexplicable pit in Majula known as the Gutter. A couple of giants and an old ant queen still live down there as we speak. Interestingly enough, though, business went on as usual beyond the stone veil of Aldia's keep, nestled deep in the very same shaded woods that were now infested with his failed experiments. In some cases, entire races of them to be exact. As I was saying, though, business went on as usual for the most part at the Aldia Mad Science HQ, even as the kingdom of Dranlake crumbled around it. His brother Vendrick would realize too late that Nishandra had been manipulating him and fled into the undead crypt where he would inevitably hollow out. Aldia, for all his efforts, peering into the essence of the soul, attempting to free himself and by extension all of humanity from the yoke of fate, ultimately failed at whatever he attempted. He appears to have attempted some sort of ritual that might allow him to transcend the cycle that had been imposed on him. Now, it's unknown what exactly he did, but whatever it was changed his state of being completely. He looks part archtree and part fire, so perhaps he bound himself to certain things from previous cycles, in this case an archtree and maybe the actual first flame itself, which would explain how he's able to manifest via bonfires. Well, it isn't exactly clear what he is or how he got that way, and the rumors were that he eventually went quiet and was never heard from again. Not that there's many non-hollowed out individuals to record history nowadays in Dranlake, but as I was saying, he basically failed at whatever he attempted. He didn't free himself from the yoke, he just sort of tied himself to it in a way that, was hard to understand. And Aldia, for all his lofty ambitions, now existed not unlike his many creations, in a state of living semi-failure. He certainly sacrificed what I could only assume would be his previous handsome appearance for what he looks like now. He's sort of just a massive fiery root head nowadays, really. I mean, you can see an eye kind of clearly, and where the other one is obscured by his root brow, you can also see a mouth, well, kind of what appears to be a mouth. And you can also make out how some of these branches may have originally been his limbs before his transformation. He's still human though, as evidenced by the massive, twisted, gnarled dark sign on his face right above where his other eyes should be. At least that's what I think it is. But yeah, this was his reward for attempting and failing to shed the yoke of fate that had been placed on him and all of his kind. And yeah, he certainly didn't go about it in a nice way, so perhaps he just visibly became the monster he always was within. Some would say that's a bit poetic, really. Turning into a monstrous abomination after turning countless innocents into monstrous abominations seems kind of fair. He seems to control the size of the monster he's able to manifest as, not really much of its appearance, but definitely its size. For example, when you meet him in the Dragon Shrine, he is what I like to refer to as Smaldia, or in his Smaldia form. And this reduced size is only due to him not being able to fit in this room, so they just kind of made him smaller to fit. But because of that, I'm going to definitely include being able to increase or decrease the size of his manifestation as one of his abilities. So yeah, clearly Aldia got the short end of the stick in regards to that ritual he attempted. But he did appear to achieve some form of immortality, just not in the way that he'd expected. He seems to have made himself a part of the first flame, or at the very least the cycles of the flame. He probably wondered what would happen to him if the flame did truly fade for good. I mean, he had nothing but time on his hands. His acolytes were quietly continuing his work in his absence under the watchful eyes of his maniac bishops, the warlocks. Eventually, his followers managed to massively populate the dragon area with breedable almost dragons, the Hellkite Wyverns, one of which seems to have taken up residence in Hyde's Tower of Flame, perhaps out of some sort of inherited memory, or maybe not, while the rest can be found in hordes swarming around the skies far above Aldia's place. If nothing else, he did bring dragons back to the world. Now, either prior to or following his transformation, I believe Aldia instructed his muse, the Emerald Herald, Shanalot, to shepherd wayward undead, or the worthy ones at least, that wound up in Dranlaig due to it now being known as a place to find a cure for the curse, and point them in the direction of the Great Ones, telling the undead to claim these ancient souls, and if the undead proved worthy and up to the task, then Aldia would appear to them as a burning tree heart thing, and begin lecturing them on the true nature of the world and life itself. The muse was then presumably instructed to guide this undead champion, this bearer of the curse, to the secluded Dranlaig castle at the very heart of the kingdom of Dranlaig, and then from there to the undead crypt beneath it, and then to the fabled dragon shrine in the heavens above it, before finally going back to Dranlaig Castle to access the throne of want deep beneath it. And throughout all of this, Aldia will occasionally manifest to the successful wanderer at each of these places, and bit by bit he explains the first sin, his own checkered past, and the past of the lands of Dranlaig and beyond. Aldia isn't the serpents of Lordran. He's not trying to push the undead one way or the other. Aldia wanted the player to have a choice, even if the choice between light and dark didn't ultimately matter in the long run anyway. There was nothing deceptively manipulative about what Aldia was doing. And even just beyond Aldia wanting the protagonist to have a choice, he wanted them to fully and truly understand the choice that they were presented with. Unlike the serpents, he's not pushing you one way or another. He just shows up and shows you the truth of the world and lets you decide for yourself how to handle it. And I think that's far more admirable and straightforward than Frampt or Koth ever was in Dark Souls 1. That's why all the while Aldia keeps showing up to question this young Hollow on their goals and opinions on all these major lore drops he keeps giving them, before he finally serves the utility as being the undead's final test in Dark Souls 2. He is the final boss, but the fight is mostly just a formality, and he drops no souls because we don't kill him. And in the end, we are presented with that choice that Aldia told us we'd have to make. We either take the throne, essentially linking the first flame, becoming the next monarch, or we completely walk away from it, abandon the throne, and essentially let the fire fade, in order to see what happens next naturally. And no matter what the bearer of the curse chooses, Aldia will bear witness to what comes next. He even narrates the final cutscene of the game if you happen to choose to abandon the throne, which to me indicates that that was his desired outcome of events. Which makes sense. I mean, it would finally allow him to see what lie beyond darkness. And I suppose that's a bit of how Dark Souls 3 can be a bit of a bubble burster. Because as we know now, since the flame wasn't properly snuffed out, and I mean, how could you when it was in that throne form, it would never truly fade out completely. Aldia and the bearer of the curse likely experienced a good chunk of an age of darkness, but it wasn't really a true one because those embers would eventually start up, or some asshole would come and link the flame while Aldia and the bearer were out wandering, exploring. The cycles did not end with Dark Souls 2, unfortunately. They would keep going, and people would keep linking the flames or occasionally letting the flame fade into utter darkness, but eventually it restarts. It always does because it wasn't snuffed out. And also, a true Age of Darkness would only lead to more stagnation in the same way that an Age of Fire would. What humanity needed was to be wholly removed from the cycle, and that's exactly what Aldia was trying to do, and it's believed that his message and his legacy had stood the test of time. Eventually, many eons would pass, and Dranlake would become a forgotten land only known by the first half of its name. It goes from being known as a place to find a cure for the curse of the undead, to being a land described as being known for the linking of the fire. Because ultimately that's what the purpose of the rumors of Dranlake being a place to cure your curse were for in the first place. Prior to Aldia's transformation, this was likely to have more undead to experiment on. Afterwards, it became more of a way to find a successor for himself. He would have his Emerald Herald put these prospects through a harrowing gauntlet, as in the entire game of Dark Souls 2 basically is Aldia's gauntlet. And then at the very end, he gives them the opportunity to either cure their curse by continuing the cycle that he has just explained to him that it's pretty fucked up for mankind and humans as a whole. Basically, linking the flame is only temporary solution at best, and it's sort of like the selfish option, but he never forces you in one way or the other. Also worth noting that the crown route from the DLCs is also a bit of a selfish and temporary solution to the whole undead curse. So if you happen to be an undead prospective champion who doesn't really give much of a shit what happens after an Age of Eternal Darkness when the fire fades, then the best bet for curing the curse as a whole would be to essentially link the flame by becoming a monarch. We experienced it firsthand in Dark Souls 2. This means of linking the first flame by assuming a throne will be continued in Dark Souls 3 with the whole return the Lords of Cinder to their thrones concept. So prior to the events of Dark Souls 3, however, Aldia, or perhaps a disciple of his, perhaps the bearer of the curse himself, or Aldia himself, made contact with the Lothric royal family, a bloodline that was destined to produce a Lord of Cinder to link the flame. And this, of course, was no ordinary royal family. The king was obsessed with becoming a dragon, and the mom was probably Guinevere, the very daughter of Big Father Time Gwyn. And this Lothric bloodline seems solely dedicated to producing an heir to link the flame. And Aldia, or again, his successor, used their vast array of knowledge to ingratiate themselves amongst the Lothric nobles, basically becoming one of the 4 pillars of Lothric's government, and thus was founded the Scholars of the Grand Archives, followers of this first scholar, who may have been Aldia, he may have been the bearer of the curse, some believe he was pontiff, not me. He also could just be some guy who found some of Aldia's stuff. But for the sake of simplicity, I believe him to either be Aldia or to be the bearer of the curse or some other successor to Aldia, which is still carrying on his legacy. And whatever the case, this first scholar has to be someone Aldia related because his signature spell, his exact sorcery is just a slightly renamed Soul Geyser, and I highly doubt that one is a coincidence. Now, these Grand Archives would contain the vast collected and accumulated knowledge of Aldia, the first scholar, basically all of the forbidden knowledge in creation, some from previous cycles even, were essentially studied in these archives by these scholars. But this knowledge of the first scholar came with a price tag on it, and it wasn't a cheap one. Yeah, that'll be your sanity, please. So yeah, these accumulated secrets of life and the truths of the world were considered madness-inducing. to say the very least. These scholars couldn't really handle, their brains couldn't process this level of forbidden lore. But they were a stubborn bunch, and they would not be deterred from learning these secrets. So the scholars of the Grand Archive eventually developed a way around this madness, these hands that grab you, not unlike Manus's hands, but a lot more skeletal. But they found a way around the madness. Candle wax. See, the scholars created this candle wax-like substance out of the skin of the first scholar. Now, many years ago when I first read that cut item description, I thought it had to be referring to Koth. But I think it can just as reasonably be applied to the bearer of the curse or any other possible successor to Aldia. Just because it's skin-based, it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be, serpent skin-based. Anyway, though, this first scholar, he was a cunning sumbitch. He supposedly served as a private tutor to the twin princes of the royal family, the heirs who were destined to supposedly link the flame one day. And in their sessions, he privately doubted the linking of the flame and likely advised them against it. He essentially suggested that they let the world stagnate. And why might this be? Well, it's anyone's guess, but he could just want to study what kind of creatures are born from this new stagnated world. I mean, we see examples like the angels and the pilgrim butterflies, other strange things like the pus of man that seem only possible in a heavily stagnated world. I mean, by the point we see it in Dark Souls 3, the world's literally converging because it's so stagnated. It's trying to essentially link the fire to itself. It's trying to bring the fire to Lothric. This is brought on by not only stagnation, but a constant repeating of these same cycles of light and dark. Age of light, age of dark, no real ending to either. This is it at its highest form. It was almost as if the very nature of the world itself had quite literally gotten sick of all these incessant cycles of light and dark over and over and over again, and it was acting out in a sort of major way. I think it was obvious at that point that linking the fire was only a temporary solution at best, and who knows what the world would do next cycle in response to it. And an Age of Utter Darkness doesn't solve anything either. We see that much in the Dark Firelink Shrine. Somehow the fire always manages to get going again, and whether that's due to some unfortunate bastard linking the fire like Ludleth of Corland, or the fire quite literally relighting itself, in a sense. It doesn't matter, the cycles would seemingly continue until the fire itself was forcibly snuffed out. And even that's sort of a gamble. Even snuffing the flame out doesn't truly seem to work if the tiny embers dancing in the darkness quote is to be taken as literally as I think it is in that ending. Attempting to free humanity from these cycles might be viewed as hopeless unless they want to return to how everything was before everybody found the Lord Souls. Which, for the 90th time in this video, is probably a conversation for another day before I get too off topic. Now, this current stagnation era that the Dark Souls 3 is in particular, was caused by the first scholar, presumably wanting to let the fire fade in hopes to see what lie beyond light and dark, while also wanting to study the various new creatures that emerged in the process of letting the flame fade. New developments like the pilgrim butterflies and the serpentine pus of man, or even further down the road, the angels of the Dreg Heap, phoenix-esque creatures that rise from the ashes of the very stagnation of the world itself. And this relentless scientific study didn't just stop at these creatures. It also extended to the abduction and subsequent painful study of Gertrude, the queen's daughter from a previous marriage, all because she allegedly made contact with an angelic messenger. And I imagine this was extremely fascinating for the scholars given Gertrude's unique nature. She had lost both her sight and her voice, and even through all the horrific torture she experienced, she was determined to record the tale. And she did so in a manner of speaking. She scrawled a bunch of chicken scratch on a piece of paper that pretty much no one can comprehend, but it one day became the very foundation of the angelic faith of Lothric, which sort of started a civil war. But I think it's all very reminiscent of the exact type of stuff Aldia and his buddies used to get up to back in the days of Dark Souls 2. You know, abducting nobles and experimenting on them, that type of thing. And I know Aldia hardly has the trademark on that, especially in the Dark Souls universe. I mean, Seath probably did it first. But it's not ridiculous or impossible to believe that either Aldia or maybe one of his disciples who followed in his footsteps, maybe even the bearer of the curse, would go on to become the first scholar of Lothric. A good deal of people believe the bearer of the curse, the protagonist of Dark Souls 2, to have become Wolnir, the High Lord of Carthus, who had conquered that land and taken all the crowns of the previous lords of Carthus and ground them down to make one superior crown for himself. It sounds a bit like what the bearer of the curse did with the crowns of the DLC kings in Dark Souls 2. It's something Vendrick personally instructed him to do. Well, a memory of Vendrick. But I think that has more to do with the whole cycles thing and history sort of repeating itself and certain concepts and symbology sort of weather and change throughout the cycles as the eons pass by. Like how we have the first flame depicted as a throne in Dark Souls 2 when it was just a straight up flame and a bowl in Dark Souls 1. And then Dark Souls 3 ran with that by, returning these Lords of Cinder to their thrones, and eventually you do go to the Fire Bowl as well. So it took both ideas and sort of blended them and made the whole thing one big, still vaguely connected continuity. Personally, I don't believe the bearer of the curse became Wolnir. I think Wolnir is just a guy who either inadvertently or knowingly followed in the bearer's footsteps as a conqueror, so to speak. And sure, I know a lot of people believe Pontiff is the first scholar, and there's a lot he's involved in with Dark Souls 3, but this is the only thing where I think he actually does not have his hand in. There was a time when I did, but nowadays it seems as though he's not really interested much in Lothric. I mean, sure, he sent some Outrider Knights, a couple named ones there, but that seemed mainly to just hinder the efforts of the undead attempting to link the flame, since the Lothric bros had denied their destiny, so he knew, for lack of a better term, that the unkindled were coming, so he took steps to slow them down. As far as I could tell, Pontiff had his sights on Irithyll, and he succeeded in taking it with the help of a Lord of Cinder, who he sort of based a whole cult around, but I don't even think Pontiff really gave much of a shit about that either. Personally, I believe Pontiff to just be a guy. I mean, sure, he's half-tree and a powerful sorcerer, very ambitious as well. That in particular would become, for lack of a better word, an inflamed trait of his after making contact with the profaned flame. He's just an extremely clever bastard who managed to benefit from the current stagnated state of the world in Dark Souls 3. A world that is, of course, only stagnated by these two twin heirs not fulfilling their destiny and linking the flame because their private tutor told them not to. The first scholar's goals could also include wanting to truly see what happens beyond an age of dark. I mean, as we know, it didn't really work out for Aldia and the bearer of the curse the first time back in Dark Souls 2 because, we see in Dark Souls 3 that it wasn't the end of all the cycles. Not yet, at least. Perhaps it wasn't the proper time for it all to end. It hadn't quite run its course yet, as it clearly has by the time of Dark Souls 3. So clearly some scrap of Aldia's legacy made it as far as possibly the last cycle of the First Flame. This legacy can be found in places like Archdragon Peak, which I don't even think would be possible were it not for his revival of the dragons and the cult during a time when it was essentially withering on a vine. Now sure, this can hardly be credited to Aldia alone, but his contributions, while great, have often gone unmentioned, especially with how the path of the dragons seems to be the true way of becoming one with the dragons. The final evolution of this thought process, if you will. Aldia had long been trying to create hybrids between dragons and men, and the path seems to be a way of ascending or evolving to a higher plane of existence, or at the very least some form of enlightenment. And that can be sort of seen as the spiritual equivalent of Aldia's much more scientific search for the secrets of life and immortality through the research of dragons and giants. There were whole nations that likely benefited from Aldia's research and didn't even know it. For example, the famous wyverns of Lothric were mounts for their knights, and curiously enough, these wyvern in particular are susceptible to the pus of man, an abyssal parasite which is usually only limited to affecting humans. Now that's certainly odd, isn't it? And I think it's perhaps a hint that the Lothric wyverns are either man-made or were resurrected in a similar way, not unlike what Aldia and his buddies were doing with the giants and dragons in Dark Souls 2. The accumulated knowledge of the first scholar in the Grand Archives would certainly contain the means to bring back the dragons. but they wouldn't necessarily be true dragons, which would explain why they're explicitly referred to as wyverns, just like the ones in Dark Souls 2 are referred to as drakes. Although I think there's one of those Hellkite wyvern drakes in Dark Souls 2 that's referred to as a guardian dragon, but you get what I mean. I think that these wyverns and Lothric sprouting pus of man-style parasites is more than enough evidence that some mad science went into either birthing these dragons or perhaps reanimating them. Yeah, it would seem Aldia's influence could be felt in the kingdom of Lothric more than anywhere else during the cycle of Dark Souls 3. There's something extremely unique about Aldia as a character and his function in the lore. I mean, he's basically just an extremely intelligent dude who decided to challenge the very gods with science. It's honestly quite badass. Unfortunately, for all this stuff we know about Aldia, we know very little about his personality and what he was like. I'm not even sure we know what the man looked like before he turned into the three-eyed raven. Sure, there's some statues around his keep that may depict what he looks like, but ultimately it's guesswork. I mean, he probably resembled Vendrick. I like to believe he was bald, like he rocked like a Charles Xavier-style bald head, but there's really nothing backing that up. And besides what we learn of him through descriptions and implications, we know very little about what Aldia was even like outside of our own interactions with him. I mean, we fight him, but it's more of a final test of worthiness, and he isn't killed. He goes with us into whatever we choose the world to be next. All we really know about him prior to his transformation is that he was ruthless, brutal, driven, and pragmatic, but it was all in service to a greater goal, a noble goal, some would say. Like, why does Gwyn get to decide what's right and what's wrong? Aldia was just doing whatever he could to oppose the restrictions set forth by long-dead gods. The only little tidbit I could find that hints as to what he was like was that he was just consistently impressed by the power of the curse and the various surreal situations that it made possible, like the case of Vengarl, a ferocious mercenary from Ferosa who had lost his head in battle, but still continues on as both head and torso independent of one another. He understood the true power of the nature of the undead curse, and that the whole undying aspect of it was a sort of sign that humans weren't always supposed to have assumed this fleeting form, as he puts it. They weren't supposed to wither away and die. They weren't supposed to appear lesser than the gods. They were on the same footing. They had just been lied to and manipulated to for eons. The only problem is that Gwyn had put that dark sign on them, which sort of forced them to be his pawns, and that messed everything up. That made the very nature of the Dark Soul and the Dark Sign, and all of it went wonky because of Gwyn's machinations. Aldia was the only person who knew that humans weren't supposed to hollow out. That wasn't supposed to happen. They weren't supposed to wither away and die. And he dedicated his life to restoring the way things were supposed to be. And this life wasn't no short life either. He was around for ages. And I like to think eventually one of the individuals who were influenced by him finally succeeded where he had failed all those years ago. And remember, Aldia just started out as a dude who was questing for knowledge, and he ended up learning of what Gwyn did and sort of took it personally. It was a slight that had for far too long gone unanswered, and Aldia sought to rectify that. He decided to master his circumstances lest they master him. And ultimately it turned him into both a monster spiritually and quite literally, as we see him in Dark Souls 2. But whether good or bad, he's still one of the most important figures in all of the lore for the Dark Souls trilogy. In my opinion, he's every bit as important as a character like Gwyn, the Lord of Light, because Aldia and all of his actions are a direct reaction to Gwyn and all of his rather questionable actions. That's probably why I spent so long recounting what Gwyn did in the beginning, because it felt necessary to fully understand why Aldia was so mad. Why he became consumed with curing this curse and undoing what Gwyn and the other gods had did to humanity. He felt cheated, he felt robbed. And he didn't just feel that way for himself, he felt that way for all of humanity. So when we see Aldia fiery, burning, glowing fucking red eye, he's not just burning for himself. He's burning for you. So yeah, that's the video. Aldia is a goddamn hero. And at some point I'll make a whole video about Pontiff as well, detailing what he was doing during Dark Souls 3 and his origins. Because as I said in this video, I do not believe he was the first scholar. I believe that to explicitly be either Aldia or one of his disciples, possibly even the bearer of the curse. But I've probably said that like 6 times throughout this video, so I'll stop repeating myself. As always though, I hope you guys found this video to be at least somewhat informative, amusing, and enjoyable, and if you liked it, please like it. If you disliked it, please dislike it, and if you like hearing me ramble on about these various characters in video games and eventually TV shows too, please consider subscribing. We're just barely away from 30k, which again, big deal for a small channel like me. And I know I eternally apologize for the delay of this video. This was probably supposed to come out a year ago, but it kept getting put on a back burner with me making little changes, and then I finally just decided to scrap the whole thing and re-record it from scratch, and that's what we're listening to here and now. But that's enough rambling out of me. Let's have our outro, shall we, and then some final thoughts. So I think a bit of a debriefing is in order after a video like that. I think it's fair to say that Aldia can be viewed as probably the most important human in Dark Souls history, or at least one of them, you know, up there with Slave Knight Gale, who also deserves a video. Because much like Gale, Aldia sacrificed everything he had. In this case, his body, his ability to experiment, his conventional state of existence, and any form or concept of morals in an effort to free humanity from Gwyn's millennia-old shackles. Shackles, mind you, that most folks went through their entire lives without ever even noticing. Aldia wished to reveal the grand deception of the world to his people, and I believe his legacy is reflected in the teachings of the first scholar of Lothric's Grand Archives, and that was, to put it simply, to doubt the linking of the flame, because once these curtains are pulled on all the godly schemes of this world, it becomes increasingly clear that linking the flame is essentially assigning yourself the role of pawn in a game that only serves the gods, and temporarily at that. As one day that flame will surely fade, as it always does, and the ones in charge will serve as the kindling for the next cycle, and so on it goes and goes and goes. Gwyn really set a precedent, and Aldia was the only person, or at least the very first, to go against that. The first human, that is. So basically, as with all things that are like Dark Souls lore or any kind of From Software lore that isn't, Sekiro, which has pretty straightforward lore, is going to be subject to speculation, I think. Like, yes, there are definitive things that happened, and there are definitive figures and, key things that are of substantial import to the overall lore that are not subject to speculation. But I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't say that a good deal of this video was speculation. It was backed with various evidence, and I tried to consider every other possible, theory while making it. I tried to give mention to those when I could remember them. So again, I'm not saying that this is definitively what happened. This is just my interpretation of things, and just conclusions I've come to that, as we can tell from the video, aren't really all that conclusive anyway. Like in the case of the first scholar, like we don't know for sure who exactly this individual was, and the whole thing about the wax being made from the first scholar's skin is technically cut content, I believe. I still maintain that I no longer believe that Pontiff was the first scholar, or even really a disciple of Aldia's. I don't think that either. For a while I did, but from what I could tell about Pontiff, he's really just involved with controlling Irithyll, and maybe he has his eyes on Lothric. It doesn't seem to be the case to me, but who knows? It seems like with Lorien and Lothric just sitting around doing nothing, that's doing exactly what Pontiff wants them to do without even his involvement, so why would he intervene? There's various lore descriptions regarding the Pontiff that I didn't reread before making this video because I wasn't trying to talk about him too much, so that'll definitely be interesting to go over again. He's actually got a pretty sweet setup with the whole Cathedral of the Deep and the Undead Settlement and how he's taken over Irithyll. It's actually quite interesting of a story that, yeah, I'm sure has been covered by a bunch of other channels, but most of them probably try to force in that whole bit about him being the first scholar and his possible dealings in Lothric, when that statue with I believe it's the profane greatsword. I read somewhere that that's actually cut content from when Pontiff Sullivan was involved in the the stuff with Lothric, and he was actually the final boss of the game instead of the Soul of Cinder in that original plan for Dark Souls 3. I think the idea is that Pontiff may have originally been the first scholar, perhaps, in the original plan, but as it stands in-game, I definitely don't think that's the case. But yeah, here I am ranting for like 5 minutes about the Pontiff character, who really is not in any focus in this video. What a way to debrief. As always, I'm sure there's some mistakes or some stuff I left out or forgot about or misinterpreted in the video, so please let me know in the comments. But the next lore video, like I said, will probably either focus on the bosses of Shadow of the Erdtree, or perhaps it'll be on the Lothric family, or maybe even Vendrick. I've been wanting to do a quick little video about the last of the Monarchs. There's a lot of good FromSoft related stuff on my blog, on my list to finish. And yeah, I know this Aldia one took me a year, but that's because I think I allowed myself to get in my head about it, and then I kept just putting it off and needing to make another video, and it's just a whole thing. You guys don't need to hear about all that. Just know that I'm probably going to cover a couple shows next. They're going to be quick little videos. They're always a pain in the ass to edit, so I'm going to try once to edit in clips of the show, and if those get copyrighted, it'll just be like video game footage or something. But I've got a lot to say about the, the state of House of Dragon Season 2 and Snowpiercer and all of its wasted potential. We've got True Detective Night Country proving once and for all that the Emmys are truly worthless. And I think I talked before how I wanted to do videos on the movies Prospect and The Signal, two of my favorite sci-fi movies of all time. They're more indie sci-fi. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that I really just want to get done. And now that I've finished this Aldia video that was sort of like this storm cloud hanging over my head, I believe I can accomplish anything. So yeah, a lot of stuff about shows, some stuff about some movies, and occasionally I'll randomly just do one about a movie or a show that I like, I think. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. There's one show in particular that actually probably will be the next video, and that is the show Troppo on Amazon Prime. I believe it's also on Freevee, but that's what kept me from watching it for a long time, because I thought it had ads. And then I saw it was with Prime, and I was like, oh, no ads, and it's an Australian TV show. Really good. Almost every Australian show or movie I've watched has been really fucking good. For example, there's The Proposition, which is an awesome Australian movie, The Rover, and Animal Kingdom. I know, yeah, funny thing, all those movies have Guy Pearce, an excellent actor. But yeah, I'm getting off topic. Troppo is an awesome show. I'll talk more about it in the video I plan to make very soon about it. It's got actor Tom Jane from Arrested Development fame, and of course the Punisher in Dirty Laundry. The guy is epic. I've always been a fan of his. He was great in The Expanse. It's nice to see he's in a good show again. And the other lead, I believe, played by Nicole Chamoun. I don't know if I'm saying her last name right, but she's excellent too. She's like, I don't want to say she's sort of like the girl with the dragon tattoo, because that's almost being like reductive in a way. That's who she reminded me of at first, but her character is so much more than that. Anyway, though, I've rambled on enough about stuff unrelated to the initial video about Aldia. There might be another one of these long, rambly style videos about the video game Bounty Hunter. I have an almost finished video that I've been working on, almost just as long as this one. Perhaps this will finally light a proverbial fire under my ass to get that one done as well. But my dog is bugging me to take him on a walk, so I'm gonna have to let everybody go for now. We've been at this for a while, though. I hope everybody's enjoyed it. I probably already said that a couple times. But yeah, we will be back very soon, and you'll be hearing from me very shortly. So until then, I hope everybody stays safe, and I'll see you next time.